In this session, we will be doing exercise on categorical syllogism. Let us know the rules of categorical syllogism. There are three rules of categorical syllogism, that is the rule of structure. This rule of structure has two sub-rules. That is, the first one is the categorical syllogism must contain three and only three propositions. When we violate this rule, then we commit the fallacy of argument of rights. The second sub-rule is the categorical syllogism must contain three and only three terms. When this rule is violated, then we commit the fallacy of four terms, that is equivocation. Then we come to the second basic rule, that is the rule of distribution of terms. It has three sub-rules. The first is the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. When this rule is violated, then we commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. Then second sub-rule is that the subject term is not distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the minor premise. So when this rule is violated, then we commit the fallacy of illicit minor. And the third sub-rule is that the predicate term is not distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the measure premise. So when this rule is violated, then we commit the fallacy of illicit measure. Now we come to the third basic rule, that is the rule of quality. In this, we have two sub-rules. The first is no conclusion can be drawn from two negative premises. When this rule is violated, then we commit the fallacy of negative premises. Second sub-rule is that when either of the premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. When this rule is violated, then we commit the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Now we must also know the distribution of terms in categorical propositions. We already know the four types of categorical propositions. So we know that in A proposition, the subject term is distributed, whereas the predicate term is undistributed. In E proposition, the subject term and the predicate term both are distributed. In I proposition, the subject term and predicate term both are undistributed. And in O proposition, the subject term is undistributed, whereas the predicate term is distributed. Now let us understand the tips to recognize the formal fallacies with reasons. First thing, you have to check how many propositions are there in an argument and see whether the first rule of structure is violated or not. And secondly, you have to check what type of propositions are there in the argument, that is whether they are A, E, I, or O, and see whether any rule of quality is violated or not. Thirdly, you have to find out each term, that is the middle term, whether it is distributed in the premises. Also, whether the subject term and the predicate term are distributed in the conclusion. If they are distributed, then check whether they are also distributed in the premise. See any rule of distribution is violated or not. Lastly, check whether any term has two meanings. See whether the second rule of structure is violated or not. Now we come to recognize with reasons the formal fallacies committed in categorical syllogism. Now we will see the example. Let us see the example. All dogs are faithful, all monkeys are faithful, some men are monkeys, therefore some men are faithful. This is an argument given to us. So now we will check how many propositions are there in it. All dogs are faithful is the first, all monkeys are faithful is the second proposition, some men are monkeys is the third, therefore some men are faithful is the fourth. So there are four propositions in an argument. So this argument ceases to be a categorical syllogism, means it is not a categorical syllogism because it violates the rule of structure that the argument must contain three and only three propositions, but this argument has more than three. So this argument commits the fallacy of argument of sorites. Now we go to the next. Now we come to the second. All apples are not red. No apples are ripe. Therefore, some ripe fruits are not red. Now there are three propositions in this argument, so it's a categorical syllogism. Now we will have to check the types of propositions in this argument. The first has the words all not, so it's an O proposition. The second has the word no, so it's an E proposition, and the conclusion has some not, so it's an O proposition. Now since the first is particular negative proposition, that is O proposition, so it's a negative proposition. The second is universal negative, E proposition, so again it's a negative proposition. So it violates the rule of quality, that is no conclusion can be drawn from two negative premises. So it commits the fallacy of negative premises. Now we go to the next one. Some citizens are not patriotic. All soldiers are patriotic. Therefore, some soldiers are citizens. Now the first one, there are three propositions. It is a categorical syllogism. Now we'll have to check the types of propositions. The first has the words some not, so it's an O proposition. The second premise has the word all, so it's an A proposition. The conclusion has the word some, so it's an I proposition. So now the first proposition is particular negative, so it's a negative proposition, whereas the conclusion is particular affirmative I proposition, so it's an affirmative. So it violates the rule that when either of the premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. So here it commits the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Now we come to the fourth one. Some animals are not carnivorous. Some animals are herbivorous. Therefore, some herbivores are not carnivorous. Now, we'll have to check what type of propositions this argument has. Because it is a categorical syllogism, it has three propositions. So we'll check the first premise. It has the word some not, so it's an O proposition. The second premise has some word some, so it's an I proposition. The conclusion has the word some not, so it's an O proposition. Now it does not violate the rule of quality because the first proposition is negative, then the conclusion is also negative. So now we'll have to check the terms. What is the subject term? What is the predicate term and the middle term? Let us see the subject of the conclusion. What is the subject of the conclusion? Herbivorous. So herbivorous is the subject of the conclusion. Let us see whether it is distributed in the conclusion. It is the subject of O proposition, so it's undistributed. Now we will check what is the predicate term. The predicate term is carnivorous. So it is, whether it is distributed or not, we'll check. It is the predicate of O proposition also. So it is distributed. Now we'll have to check whether it is distributed in the premise also or not. It lies in the first premise. So the first premise is the measure premise. And it is the predicate of O proposition there. So it is distributed there also. Now we will check the middle term. The middle term is animals. Because it is the common element among the two premises and does not lie in the conclusion. So this middle term, let us see whether it is distributed or not. In the first premise, it is the subject of O proposition, so it is undistributed. In the second premise, it is the subject of I proposition, so it is undistributed. Now we will see whether any rule is violated in the case of subject term. Since it is undistributed in the conclusion, the violation does not arise. Now let us see the predicate term. The predicate term also is distributed in the conclusion, but it is also distributed in the premise. So the violation does not arise. Now we'll check the middle term. It is undistributed in both the premises. So it has violated the rule that the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. So it commits the fallacy of undistributed middle. Now we will do the fifth one. All salesmen are good businessmen. No extrovert person are good salesmen. Therefore, no extrovert person are good businessmen. So in this argument, we have three propositions. So it is a categorical syllogism. Now we'll see the types of proposition in this argument. The first has the word all. So it's an A proposition. The second has the word no. So it's an E proposition. The third, that is the conclusion, has the word no. So it's an E proposition. Now it does not violate the rule of quality because the second premise is negative. So the conclusion is also negative. Now we'll have to see the terms in this argument. Now let us see the middle term. What is the middle term? The middle term is the common term between the two premises, that is salesmen. Let us see whether it has been distributed in the premises. In the first premise, it is the subject of A proposition, therefore it is distributed. In the second premise also it is distributed because it is the predicate of E proposition. Since it is distributed at least once, so it does not violate the rule of middle term. Now we will see what is the subject term of the conclusion. The subject term of the conclusion is extrovert. Okay. Let us see whether it is distributed in the conclusion. It is the subject of E proposition, so it is distributed in the conclusion. Now let us see whether it is distributed in the premise also. Yes, it is distributed in the premise in the second premise, which is the minor premise, because it is the subject of E preposition there also. Now let us see what is the predicate term. The predicate term is businessmen. Okay. Now it is the predicate of E preposition also. So the predicate of the conclusion is distributed. Now we'll have to check whether it is distributed in the premise also. It lies in the first premise, so it's the measure premise. Now let us see whether it is distributed or not. In the premise, it is, in the measure premise, it is undistributed because it is the predicate of a proposition. So it violates the rule of distribution of terms. That is, the predicate term is not distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the measure premise. So the fallacy of illicit process, which process illicit measure, is committed. Now we'll go to the next. All carpenters are skillful. All carpenters are hardworking. Therefore, all hardworking people are skillful. Okay. Now there are three propositions. So it is a categorical syllogism. Now we'll have to check what type of propositions they have. It has the first premise has the word all, so it's an A proposition. The second premise has the word all, so it's an A proposition. The third conclusion has all, so it's an A proposition. Now, it does not violate the rule of quality, so we'll have to check the terms. So what is the middle term here? Carpenters. It is the common element between the two premises, okay, which lies only in the premises and not in the conclusion. Let us see whether it is distributed or not. In the first premise, it is distributed because it is the subject of a proposition, universal proposition. In the second also, it is distributed because it is the subject of a proposition. So the violation of rule does not arise of middle term. So now we will have to check the subject and the predicate term. What is the predicate term of the conclusion? Skillful. Okay. And it is also the predicate of a proposition. So it is undistributed. So the question of violation does not arise. Now we'll have to check the subject term. Subject term is, of the conclusion is hardworking. Okay. Now let us see whether it is distributed in the conclusion or not. It is distributed in the conclusion. It is distributed. Why? Because it is the subject of a proposition, universal proposition. So now we'll have to check whether it is, where does it lie? It lies in the second premise. We'll have to see whether it is distributed there or not. It is called the minor premise. It is undistributed in the premise because it is the predicate of a proposition. So it violates the rule that the subject term is not distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the minor premise. So the fallacy of illicit minor is committed. Now we come to the seventh one. All trees have bark, all dogs bark. Therefore, all dogs are trees. There are three propositions, so it's a categorical syllogism. Here, let us see the types of proposition. The first premise is having all, so it's an A proposition. The second premise is having the word all, so it's an A proposition. The conclusion is having the word all, so it's also an A preposition. Now we'll have to see whether the rule of quality has been violated. No, it has not been violated because both the premises are affirmative. Now we will go to see the subject term, predicate term, and the middle term. Now what is the subject of the conclusion? Dogs. Okay. And let us see whether it is distributed or not. It is distributed because it is the subject of a proposition, universal proposition. So we'll have to check whether it is distributed in the premise. Where does it lie? In the second premise. So second premise is the minor premise, and it is distributed in the premise also because it is the subject of a proposition. Now we'll have to check the predicate term. The predicate term is trees. It is the predicate of a proposition also. So in the conclusion, it is undistributed. So the question of violation does not arise when it is undistributed in the conclusion. So now we will have to check what is the middle term. The middle term is bark, which is the common element between the two premises and does not lie in the conclusion. Okay, so let us see whether it is distributed or not. In the first premise, it is undistributed because it is the predicate of a proposition, and it is also undistributed in the second premise because it is the predicate of a proposition again. So it does violate the rule of undistributed middle. And it also has two meanings. Bark in the first premise means the part of the tree, and in the second premise it means the voice of the dogs. So here it has also committed the second rule, means it has violated the second rule also. That is, the word bark has two meanings. So first rule is violation is that the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. So the fallacy of undistributed middle is committed because the rule that the middle term should be distributed at least once in the premise is violated. And since bark has two meanings, the fallacy of four terms is committed. How many terms we have? The categorical syllogism must have only three terms, but bark is ambiguous. It has two meanings. So we'll have four terms. That is, first is dogs, second is trees, third is part of the tree, and fourth is voice of dogs. So there are four terms. So the violation of the rule that the argument must contain three and only three terms is there, and we commit the fallacy of four terms equivocation. So now we come to the next. 8. No athletes are trained hard. Some film stars are not athletes. Therefore, some film stars are not trained hard. Let us see how many propositions are there. There are 3 propositions. Okay. So, it's a categorical syllogism. Now we'll have to check the types of propositions in it. The first has the word no, so it's an E proposition. The second has some not in it, so it's an O proposition. And the conclusion has some not in it, so it's an O proposition. Since the first proposition has E in it, is E, it's universal negative, so it's a negative proposition. The second also is particular negative, so it's a negative proposition. So it violates the rule that no conclusion can be drawn from two negative premises. So argument is invalid and commits the fallacy of negative premises. Now we come to the ninth one. All healthy people are athletes. Some athletes are active. Therefore, some active people are healthy. Now here there are three propositions. It is a categorical syllogism. So now we'll have to check the types of propositions in it. The first is having all, so it's an A proposition. The second is having some, so it's an I proposition. The conclusion is having some, so it's an I proposition. It does not violate any rule of quality because both the premises are affirmative. So now we'll have to check the terms in it. Let us see the subject term. The subject term of the conclusion is active. And it is the subject of I proposition. So it's undistributed in the conclusion. Now healthy is the predicate of the conclusion. And it is the predicate of I proposition also. So it is also undistributed. So the question does not arise of illicit process, violation of illicit process. So now we'll check the middle term. The middle term is athletes. It lies in both the premises but not in the conclusion. Let us see whether it is distributed or not. In the first premise, it is undistributed. Why? Because it is the predicate of a proposition. In the second premise, also it is undistributed because it is the subject of I proposition. So it violates the rule that the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. So it commits the fallacy of undistributed middle. Now we come to the 10th one. All mammals are warm-blooded. No fish are mammals. Therefore, some fish are warm-blooded. Now there are three propositions here. So it's an categorical syllogism. Now we will check what type of propositions are there in this argument. First premise has all in it, so it's an A proposition. The second premise has no in it, so it's an E proposition. The third conclusion has some, so it's an I proposition. So now we'll check the rule of quality. The second premise is E proposition, so universal negative. So it's a negative premise. Whereas the conclusion is particular affirmative, it is I proposition, it is affirmative. So it violates the rule that when either of the premises is negative, the conclusion must be negative. So the fallacy committed here is the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. So now we come to the 11th one. Now we'll do the 11th one. This book is informative. Book the tour. Therefore, this tour is informative. Now, let us see how many propositions are there in this argument. There are three propositions in this argument. So, it's a categorical syllogism. Now, since all the three propositions are singular propositions, but they are affirmative, so they are considered as A propositions in traditional logic. So, they are all A propositions. Now, we'll have to check the Rule of quality, whether it is violated, it has not violated because all the three are affirmative. Now we will have to check the subject, predicate, middle term, all the terms in the argument. Now informative is the predicate term of the conclusion. It is also the predicate of a proposition. So it is undistributed in a proposition. So the question does not arise to check whether it is distributed in the premise or not. Now we will see the subject term of the conclusion. The subject term of the conclusion is tour. Okay. Now it is the subject of a proposition, therefore it is distributed in the conclusion. So we'll have to check whether it is distributed in the premise. It lies in the second premise, so the second premise is the minor premise, and it is undistributed in the minor premise because it is the predicate of a proposition. So it violates the rule of distribution of terms, that is, the subject term is not distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the minor premise. So it commits the fallacy of illicit minor. Now we will check the middle term. The middle term is book. Okay, it is the subject of a proposition in the first premise. So it is distributed in the first premise and also in the second premise because it is the subject of a proposition. So it does not violate the rule of distribution of middle term. Now we'll have to check whether it has more than one meaning. Book in the first premise means printed work, and in the second premise it means reserve. So it means two things. It is ambiguous. Book is ambiguous and it has two meanings. So we will have four terms. The first is the tour, that is the subject term, informative, which is the predicate term. Then we have printed work, which is the middle term, and the other middle term is reserve, that is the fourth term. So we have four terms here. So we are violating the rule of structure that the argument must contain three and only three terms, and we commit the fallacy of four terms, that is equivocation. So now we go to the next. Now in this 12th one, let us see how many propositions are there. The first one is some reporters give correct news. Second is all reporters are impartial. Third is no impartial persons give correct news. And fourth is therefore some reporters are not impartial. So we are having four propositions. So we are violating the rule of structure, that is the argument must contain three and only three propositions. So we commit the fallacy of argument of Sorites. So we have learned how to recognize formal fallacies in categorical syllogism. Thank you.